period of time. And wetlands are a very valuable role in reducing the level of flooding, both up here in the headwaters and also for Cedar Swamp, regulating the amount of flooding downstream. The plants themselves, the wetland soils, the physical obstruction of the flow of water by the wetland has slowed the water flow down. So instead of having it rushing downstream at a great rate, it goes downstream much more slowly. And the wetland absorbs the water and holds it and releases it gradually throughout the year. So that even when a flood occurs, it's not as severe as it would be if the wetlands weren't present. And this is not Cedar Swamp. This is, in fact, the Ipswich River, but it was the only slide I could find of a good river in flood. This is backwards, too. I think probably these are all backwards. This is the town of Wetland. In 1968, many of you may remember, there was a major flood, the largest we've had in the last 3 decades. And the town of Wetland was pretty well inundated by the Sudbury. This is well downstream of here, but it's important to realize that your swamp up here in the headwaters helps reduce the amount of damage that takes place even during floods like this in the lower reaches of the river basin. Excuse me. The other thing that takes place during this periodic flood and drying cycle, as I mentioned, is that the wetland stores the water to some extent and is able to release the water gradually throughout the year so that we continue to have water flowing in your streams. We can go a long period of time between rainstorms without having our streams dry up. And part of this is because of the way wetlands regulate the flow of water over time. This maintaining of water flow function of wetlands is very valuable to us in terms of our water supplies, both for surface water supplies. Of course, we've got the Sudbury Reservoir downstream, which is a backup supply for the NWRA, although it's not in use right now. So your surface water flows are important, and wetlands are also very important for groundwater supply protection. Diagram of the water cycle. When it rains, water hits the ground and it will do one of a couple things. It will either percolate into the ground or it will run off the surface. When it runs off the surface, we're used to seeing it running down the gutters along the streets and into the catch basins and so on, and we don't really think about what happens when it goes into the ground unless we're gardeners and we recognize that when it rains it's good because it goes down and waters our plants. It continues to go down through the soil, that water that goes into the ground, and ultimately reaches the groundwater table. And water flows underground through the spaces within the soil and the rocks, and ultimately discharges to the surface. A lot of the flow that we see in our streams, a lot of the water that we have in our lakes and ponds is the result of water that's flowed underground and then surfaced at springs. Excuse me. Within the stream or within the lake, and also many of our wetlands are sources of groundwater discharge. This diagram just shows you how groundwater flow underground pretty much parallels the way surface water flow would be flowing along the surface of the ground, and ultimately discharging, in this case, to a river system in the center. Not bothering with everyone. Wetlands are important places in some cases for groundwater recharge, although most of our wetlands in Massachusetts are places where groundwater is coming up to the surface. In places like Cedar Swamp, where you've got a major headwater wetland, floodplain wetland, it's also an important source of groundwater recharge, especially along the edges. And it's interesting that many municipalities, many industrial facilities and commercial facilities find that they put their wells in close to the edge of wetlands and get very good water supplies. And many of you may be aware that just along Flanders Road there are 3 new wells servicing 3 of the new industrial buildings that have been put in there fairly recently. I'm going to try one more time. Yeah. This is a map showing, this is backwards too. Yep. Okay. You see Westborough on there? See if I can pull it out for you. And it's tied to this thing. There's Worcester. There's Westborough. Here's the Sudbury River going down. And here, this blue area, there's a very large aquifer system that starts up here in the headwaters and continues down. A groundwater system that contains large amounts of water that flows to the surface and helps supply the Sudbury River and also can provide water supply. And as I mentioned, many of your industrial and commercial buildings around here are obtaining water supply from this aquifer. Southborough obtains water supply. Those little black dots are wells that were in place when this map was prepared about 10 years ago. Now I mentioned that the edges of wetlands are very important very often for recharge and also for water supplies. The edges of wetlands are also the areas that are most sensitive to disturbance. They're the easiest areas to fill, to bulldoze, whether it's to build industrial buildings or whether to excavate gravel or whether to put in new schools or whatever. Our edges of wetlands are the areas that are being nibbled away throughout the state, and certainly in Westborough is no exception. Drinking water, not only in terms of quantity, but quality. You know, we don't care how much drinking water is there in particular if it's not safe to drink. And more people seem to be going to the store and buying this sort of stuff rather than drinking pure water out of the ground or out of their reservoirs. And wetlands have a very important function in cleansing water. And again, it's the soil and the vegetation that, by slowing water flow down, causes sediment to trickle, to settle out, carrying with it many contaminants that might be carried in the water. I'm not going to show this. This is a horrible diagram the USGS made. This is just an example, backwards, of how houses with septic systems, the septic system flow underground, intercepted by a wetland, and the wetland plants will remove, for instance, the nitrogen, it's a plant nutrient, and be able to remove many of the other materials, so that a well on the other side of the wetland pumping water wouldn't receive those contaminants coming out of the septic systems. Wetlands and the materials that they remove from water and also the materials they release into water are very important in terms of aquatic food chains. Many of you are familiar with swamp water, this brown water that you see coming out of many wetlands. And many people look at this askance and think this is terrible, that it's polluted water. This brown water contains many nutrients that are absorbed by many aquatic invertebrates and other animals that ultimately serve for larger animals that serve as food for fish such as this pickerel here. Okay. Many people are aware that our coastal wetlands are the base for our commercial marine fisheries, but a lot of people aren't aware that our inland wetlands are also really important for our inland freshwater fisheries that supported our Native American populations and our early settlers and support our recreational fisheries today as well. This whole food chain that's supported by the wetland together supports a whole variety of plants and animals. Those of you that heard Chris Leahy's talk got to hear a very in-depth discussion of the variety of plants and animals that live in a place like Cedar Swamp. I'm just going to talk about a few of them very briefly in sort of the context of wetlands as a whole. The fish that are supported by the wetland and supported in the downstream brooks and streams that flow out of the wetland serve as food for the green herring that we just saw, the black-crowned night heron, great blue herons, osprey, which are coming back into Massachusetts, fish eaters as well, supported by the nutrient flows and the various smaller organisms that are fed by wetlands. Okay. Other fish eaters such as otters and minks as well are supported by this flow of food through the wetland. And it's this flooding drying cycle in wetlands that helps cause this decay and provide this tremendous amount of food that's available to support such a great variety of different types of life. The seasonal flooding and growth of the wetland plants and then their decay, breakdown by the microorganisms and the larger animals in the wetland supports just a tremendous variety. You could take a chunk of mud like this, stick it in an aquarium and cover it with water, and within a week or two you'd find a whole variety of small critters swimming around, including mosquito larvae, possibly, but also a whole variety of small crustaceans, snails, and a lot of other different types of critters. And these in turn, in the wetland itself, would serve as food for the nymphs of dragonflies. Dragonfly nymphs have a wonderful steam shovel type scoop that they keep under their chin, and then when something comes along that they want to eat, this big hydraulic mechanism goes out and snaps up the food organism, brings it in, and they munch away. It's quite a remarkable thing to see in action. And then they emerge out of the water system and come to the terrestrial realm, where any mosquito larvae that didn't get eaten while they were in the water, the adults get fed on by the adult dragonflies. This is another example of a wetland dragonfly species. The great variety of insects that are growing within a wetland and emerging serve as food for the water thrushes and many of the other birds. Anyway, the redwing is, of course, another bird. This is a bird that's very interesting. You know, it started out as a real wetland bird, and then especially in the Midwest, where so many of our wetlands were drained, this is an animal that's undergone a lot of change in its behavior. Now they do very well in dry fields in the Midwest because where there aren't wetlands for them to breed in. A whole variety of our woodland birds may take advantage of the food that's provided by wetlands in their foraging for their young. Our wetlands also provide habitat for a variety of wildlife that can't survive in the uplands alone. That TV segment that you saw before the program mentioned a spotted turtle. And this is an animal that depends on vernal pools. And you have a population of, or a couple populations of, here in the Cedar Swamp. It's quite a spectacular looking turtle with those bright yellow spots. And another animal that also uses vernal pools, these temporary pond systems, is another black animal with bright yellow spots, the spotted salamander. People sometimes find these in their basements where they fall in as they're walking along. These animals, again, like so many wetland animals, spend part of their life in the upland and part of their life in the wetland. They'll be migrating any time now. Once it starts to get warm and we get a warm spring rain, these animals will be migrating across roads and through the woods to the vernal pools to lay their eggs. And they undergo these tremendous mating swarms in the pools where hundreds of them will go through a sort of dance in the water. And there are people that go out at night with flashlights during this and watch this phenomenon. It's one of the most spectacular things that goes on in nature in Massachusetts. And most people aren't aware that it's happening. They think it's mud season and there's nothing happening yet. And this fantastic event is taking place in ponds right in their backyards. So, as I mentioned, there's tremendous diversity of life going on in wetlands. The plant life, the animal life. You get a variety of different types of plants. The skunk cabbages are starting to come up out of the ground now. The fern ponds aren't quite unrolling yet. And this variety of life in wetlands, the high-bush blueberries, the skunk cabbage, they provide food for this wide range of wildlife. They also provide a lot of beauty. The cardinal flower is one of our most spectacular flowers in Massachusetts. The bright red also attracts things like hummingbirds. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good hummingbird fly to accompany it with. And some of our most really almost lowly plants. Probably everybody knows the jewelweed or the touch-me-not. It was one of the first plants I learned as a child, and its seeds are a very important source of food for a whole variety of wildlife. Those little seed pods that burst when you touch them. Fiddleheads. Why are we doing this? Not only rare wildlife depends on wetlands, things like the spotted turtle, but some of our more common species, like white-tailed deer or raccoon, will spend part of their time feeding in wetlands, make use of the great variety of food that's available to them. Snapping turtles, very common in our wetlands. And a whole variety of other turtles, painted turtles. Red-shouldered hawks will feed in wetlands, as will marsh hawks and many of the other predatory birds. And garter snakes will feed on the frogs and the salamanders and the mice that you have, as well as many of the larger insects in the wetland. It's a whole diverse and very tightly connected system, ranging from the very large and complex to the smaller and very easily overlooked if you aren't paying attention. And it includes us as well. And that's all I have to say for my talk. I will be happy to answer any questions. And I apologize for the technical difficulties. Are there any questions? Yes.
I don't know much about parks in Westborough, but I know in Worcester, that's a big city, and they have parks. Now here, they don't see the swamp, they really have some golf course. There's something else. I mean, I'm just going to say this, I can't think of any other. This is one possibility we have for a park.
Mike, would you like to address that? I don't live in Westborough, so I don't know what your parks are either.
What I'm saying is, it has really,
I don't know. I don't have a...
Where we have, what's the one down on Cedar Swamp? Are you talking about a sanctuary type area, or do you mean fill in something and create a... Someplace that people don't live?